Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 25, Lewis, Clark, Sacagawea, the Barbary Wars, and the Atlantic slave trade. Continuing our expose into pseudo-history. Anecdotes. The difference between history and the anecdote is that history is the aggregate of past events, while anecdotes is a short account of a real incident or person, often humorous or interesting. Anecdotal evidence is a story told by individuals. It comes in many forms. It can range from product testimonials to word of mouth. It's often testimony or a short account about the truth or ineffectiveness of a claim. Typically, anecdotal evidence focuses on individual results, is driven by emotion, is presented by not subject area experts. Humans are more likely to tell and remember dramatic, extraordinary personal stories. Throw in some emotion, and you're more likely to believe the story. In psychological terms, statistical analysis of carefully collected data from well-designed experiments lacks that emotional kick. It's sad, but true. Anecdotal evidence can be a powerful tool to derive unique insights from your data if used properly. If you have a disciplined approach, the information won't mislead you. It can generate a better understanding of what you're researching. If there's one takeaway, it's this. Let anecdotal evidence drive your questions, and data analytics support the answer. The historical method plays a crucial role in your data analytics process. Systematically testing your thesis and communicating the conclusions from the results is how data helps us make more informed strategic decisions. However, do not be misled by the term data science, as there is an art to it as well. There's practically an infinite number of these to develop when approaching history. Therefore, choosing the one to test is an art form. It allows and often requires creativity to gain the most valuable insights. Anecdotal evidence provides us with a traditional information beyond that of a typical data point. There could be a counterintuitive patterns present in those stories or variables that you hadn't considered. Lewis and Clark Expedition. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, a U.S. military expedition led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark to explore the Louisiana Purchase and the Pacific Northwest. The journey was a significant chapter in the history of American exploration. On January 18, 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sent a secret message to Congress asking for $2,500 to send an officer and a dozen soldiers to explore the Missouri River, make diplomatic contact with Indians, expand the American fur trade, and locate the Northwest Passage, the much sought-after hypothetical northwestern water route to the Pacific Ocean. The proposed trip took on the added significance on May 2nd, when the United States agreed to the Louisiana Purchase, Napoleon's sale of 828,000 square miles of French territory for $27 million. Jefferson, who had already sponsored several attempts to explore the West, asked his secretary Meriwether Lewis to lead the expedition. Lewis was dispatched to Philadelphia for instructions in botany, celestial navigation, medicine, and zoology. He also purchased supplies and spent $20 on a Newfoundland dog, Seaman. Lewis procured weapons at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now in West Virginia, supervised the construction of a 55-foot keel boat, and secured smaller vessels, in addition to designing an iron-frame boat that could be assembled on the journey. His co-commander, he selected William Clark, who had been his military superior during the government's battles with the Northwest Indian Federation in the early 1790s. The Secretary of War denied Lewis his request for a shared command. Still, Captain Lewis and Lieutenant Clark chose to address one another as captain to hide this fact from the expedition other members. For his part, Clark recruited men in Kentucky, oversaw their training that winter at Camp River du Bois in Illinois, and served as the expedition's principal waterman and cartographer. Throughout the trip from May 14, 1804 to September 23, 1806, from St. Louis, Missouri to the Pacific Ocean and back, the Corps of Discovery, as the expedition company was called, traveled nearly 8,000 miles. Numbering about 4 men, the entourage covered 10 to 20 miles a day, pushing and pulling their 10-ton keel boat up the Missouri River. Lewis's iron frame boat was later assembled and covered with skins near Great Falls, in present-day Montana, but had to be abandoned because of the seam leaks, and there was no pitch to seal them. The captains and at least 5 others kept journals. President Jefferson had instructed Lewis to observe latitude and longitude and take detailed notes about the soil, climate, animals, plants, and native peoples. Lewis identified 178 plants new to science, including bitterroot, prairie sagebrush, Douglas fir, and ponderosa pine, as well as 122 animals such as a grizzly bear, prairie dog, and pronghorn antelope. The expedition encountered immense animal herds and ate well, consuming 1 buffalo, 2 elk, or 4 deer per day, supplemented by roots, berries, and fish. They named geographic locations after expedition members, peers, loved ones, and even their dogs, aka Seaman's Creek. They experienced dysentery, venereal disease, boils, tick bites, and injuries from prickly pear, yet only 1 man perished throughout the entire journey. Another primary objective involved diplomacy with Native Americans. The expedition held councils with Indians in which the Corps had military parades, handed out peace medals, flags, and gifts, delivered speeches, promised trade, and requested intertribal peace. There was also something of a magic show. Magnets, compasses, and Lewis's air gun. An invitation for Indian representatives to travel to Washington, D.C. Most tribes welcomed trading opportunities and provided the expedition with food, knowledge, guides, shelter, sex, and entertainment. However, the Lakota, encountered in South Dakota, already had British commercial ties and did not view American competition favorably, mainly because it would make their enemies stronger. Their attempt to prevent the expedition from continuing upstream nearly turned violent, but Chief Black Buffalo's diplomacy diffused the situation. The expedition arrived at the Mandan villages near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota, and constructed Fort Mandan to spend the winter. The captains prepared maps, artifacts, mineral samples, plant specimens, and papers to send back in the spring. On April 7, 1805, a small crew departed on a St. Louis-bound keelboat laden with boxes of material for Jefferson that included live magpies and a prairie dog. Meanwhile, the permanent party proceeded up Missouri in 6 canoes and 2 boats. It now consisted of 33 people, including soldiers, civilians, Clark's slave York, and 2 newly hired interpreters, a French-Canadian, Toussaint Charbonneau, and a Shoshone wife, Sacagawea, who had given birth to a boy, Jean-Baptiste, that February. On June 2, 1805, the expedition party arrived at the fork at the river. Not knowing which waterway was the principal stream, they sent out reconnaissance parties up both divisions. Although the evidence was not conclusive, the captains believed the South Fork to be a significant course while everyone else favored the North. Lewis named the North Fork Maria's River and instructed the party to continue the South Fork. This choice proved correct when the expedition arrived at the Great Falls almost 2 weeks later. An 18-mile portage around the falls was made even more difficult by broken terrain, prickly pear cactus, hailstorms, and numerous grizzly bears. On July 4, 1805, the party finished the portage and, to celebrate Independence Day, consumed the last of their 120 gallons of alcohol and danced into the night. Arriving at 3 forks of the Missouri River, the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin Rivers, Sacagawea recognized Beaverhead Rock and informed the others that they would soon encounter some Shoshones. Lewis climbed Lemmy Pass, crossing the Continental Divide, only to have his hopes for a single mountain portage dashed by the view of endless mountains stretching before him. "I discovered immense ranges of high mountains still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered in snow, he wrote. Fortunately, in mid-August, he met a Shoshone band led by Sacagawea's brother, who provided the expedition with horses. The Shoshone guide Old Toby joined the trip and led them across the Bitterroot Range. On the crossing, Clark lamented, "I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Indeed, I was at one time fearful my feet would freeze in the thin moccasins which I wore." Cold and hungry, the expedition finally spilled out of the mountains into the prairie, the homeland of the Nez Perce. Upon the recommendations of a respected older woman, the Nez Perce befriended the expedition. After leaving their horses with Chief Twisted Hair, the explorers followed out 5 cottonwood canoes and floated down the Clearwater and Snake Rivers, reaching the Columbia River on October 16. They finally arrived at the Pacific Ocean in mid-November, with Clark recording in his journal, quote, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." Fierce storms delayed their progress for nearly a month. The members conducted a democratic vote on where to spend the winter, with even York and Sacagawea casting votes. Near present-day Astoria, Oregon, the Corps built Fort Clatsop and endured a wet, miserable winter by journal writing, drying meat, making salt, and traveling to see a beached whale. They hoped to encounter vessels along the Pacific that they could transport their home, but finding none, they did an about-face, planning to return along the Columbia and Missouri rivers. After stealing a Clatsop Indian canoe, they headed up the Columbia on March 23, 1806. They arrived at the Nez Perce villages, gathering their horses, and waited for the snow to melt. On July 3rd, after recrossing the Bitterroots, the expedition divided into several groups to better explore the region and 2 major tributaries of Missouri. Several groups floated down the Great Falls, digging up supplies they had cached on their outward journey. Meanwhile, Clark arrived at the Yellowstone River after crossing Bozeman Pass, the route suggested by Sacagawea. After constructing 2 canoes, he carved his name and the date in sandstone outcropping Pompey's Tower, or now known as Pompey's Pillar, named for Sacagawea's son, whom Clark had called Pomp. In the meantime, Lewis and 3 men met 8 Blackfeet on July 26 on a tributary of Maria's River near present-day Cut Bank, Montana. A deadly altercation occurred when the explorers shot 2 warriors who had stolen their horses and guns. Fleeing on horseback for 24 hours straight, the foursome arrived at the Missouri River to rejoin other expedition members who were floating downstream. Farther on, this group reunited with Clark, bid farewell to the Charbonneaus, and floated downstream, completing the journey. The Corps Discovery met with a grand reception at St. Louis on September 23rd. Congress awarded them with double pay and public land. Each of the captains received 1,600 acres, and their men received 320 acres. The final cost of the expedition totaled $38,000. Jefferson appointed Lewis governor of Upper Louisiana Territory and appointed Clark an Indian agent. Some of the journeys stayed in the military, others entered the fur trade, while still others took to farming in the region or returned east. Some insist Lewis and Clark's legacy is insignificant because they were not the first non-Indians to explore the area, did not find an all-water route across the continent, and failed to publish their journals in a timely fashion. Although the first official accounts appeared in 1814, the 2-volume narrative did not contain their scientific achievements. Nevertheless, the expedition contributed significant geographic and scientific knowledge of the West, aided the expansion of the fur trade, and strengthened the U.S. claims to the Pacific. Clark's maps portraying the geographic makeup of the West, printed in 1810 and 1814, were the best available until 1840s. No American exploration looms larger in U.S. history. The Lewis and Clark expedition has been commemorated with stamps, monuments, and trails, and has had numerous places named after it. St. Louis hosted the 1904 World's Fair during the expedition's centennial, and Portland, Oregon sponsored the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition. In 1978, Congress established the 3,700-mile Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. While Lewis and Clark had a great interest in documenting Indian cultures, they represented a government whose policies cannot be seen to have fostered dispossession and cultural genocide. This dichotomy was on display during the event's bicentennial, commemorated by 2 years of special events across the expedition route. Sacagawea. Sacagawea was an interpreter and guided Meriwether Lewis and William Clark's expedition westward from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast. Though spelled numerous ways in the journals of expedition members, Sacagawea is generally believed to be a Hidatsa name, Saga meaning bird, and Wea meaning woman. In that case, the third syllable starts with a hard G, as there is no soft G in the Hidatsa language. However, many Shoshone Indians maintain that it is a Shoshone name meaning boat launcher, and is pronounced Sacagawea. Sacagawea was born 1788 in what is now the state of Ohio. When she was approximately 12 years old, Sacagawea was captured by an enemy tribe, the Hidatsa, and taken from her Limhi Shoshone people to the Hidatsa village near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. Following her capture, French-Canadian trader Toussaint Charbonneau, living among the Hidatsa, claimed Sacagawea as one of his wives. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase of Western Territory from France by President Thomas Jefferson nearly doubled the size of the United States. With the acquisition of so much land, it was necessary to determine the actual boundaries of the country. Jefferson hired Virginia's Meriwether Lewis to explore the land. Lewis sought out frontiersman William Clark, and together they led about 40 men in 3 boats up the Missouri River. During the winter months, Lewis and Clark decided to build their encampment, Fort Mandan, near the Hidatsa Mandan villages where Charbonneau and Sacagawea lived. Charbonneau proposed that Lewis and Clark hire him as a guide and interpreter. Charbonneau knew Hidatsa and the sign language common among the river tribes. Additionally, his marriage to the Shoshone Sacagawea would be helpful as they traveled west, where they would likely encounter a need to trade with the Shoshone. Lewis and Clark hired Charbonneau as a member of their expedition, the Corps of Discovery, while Sacagawea was expecting her first child. The Americans stayed in a relatively safe and warm camp through the winter of 1804 to 1805 and waited in the spring so that Sacagawea could accompany them west. On February 11, 1805, Sacagawea gave birth to Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, whom Clark later nicknamed Pomp, meaning firstborn in Shoshone. Her baby on her back and her husband by her side, Sacagawea and the men left Fort Mandan on April 7, 1805. At about 17 years of age, she was the only woman among 31 older men on this expedition portion. Each member of the Corps of Discovery was hired for particular skills such as hunting, woodworking, blacksmithing, and sailing. Though Sacagawea's role as a guide was limited to the Idaho-Montana region where she had grown up, rather than the entirety of the expedition, she still proved critical to the Corps. Her knowledge of the Shoshone and Hidatsa's language was a great help during the journey. She communicated with other tribes and interpreted for Lewis and Clark. She was also skilled at finding edible plants, which proved crucial for supplementing their rations along the journey. Further, Sacagawea was valuable to the expedition because her presence signified peace and trustworthiness. A group of men traveling with a woman and her baby appeared less menacing than an all-male group, which could have been mistaken for a war party. Sacagawea and her baby helped those they encountered feel it was safe to befriend the newcomers. However, only Sacagawea's husband ever received payment for work on the expedition despite all her contributions. Sacagawea faced the same dangers and difficulties as the rest of the expedition members, in addition to caring for her infant son. During a crisis on May 14, 1805, Sacagawea showed bravery and clear thinking that earned Lewis and Clark's praise and gratitude. Charbonneau was steering a boat through choppy waters when a sudden gust of wind caused the ship to tip sideways and fill with water. The expedition's valuable supplies fell into the water, and Charbonneau froze. Sacagawea stayed calm and rescued instruments, books, gunpowder, medicine, and clothing from the water. Without these supplies, the expedition would have been in serious trouble. On July of 1805, the Corps traveled up the Missouri River when Sacagawea recognized the 3 forks of the Missouri River. They were near an area where her people had camped. On August 15, 1805, the expedition encountered the Shoshone tribe. Lewis and Clark arranged for a meeting with the chief, and Sacagawea served as a translator. As she began interpreting, she realized that the chief was, in fact, her brother. She ran to embrace him and wept from joy. Though she was moved to tears, she resumed her duties as interpreter. She convinced the Shoshone to provide additional guides and horses to the expedition members. Sacagawea continued with the Corps of Discovery, and the expedition reached the Pacific Ocean on November 15, 1805. Soon after, they needed to determine where they would establish their winter quarters. Clark's journal showed that Sacagawea contributed to this decision, a sign of respect that the white male crew members held for her knowledge of the land. They built Fort Clatsop near the Columbia River and stayed there until March 23, 1806. For the return journey, the Corps divided into two groups, one led by Lewis and the other by Clark. Traveling with Clark, Sacagawea guided his group south of the Yellowstone River by recommending a route through the Rocky Mountains, today known as Bozeman's Pass. Clark wrote in his journal on July 13, 1806, "The Indian woman has been a great service to me as a pilot through this country." The two groups reunited on August 12, 1806. They arrived at the Hidatsa village 2 days later, where Sacagawea and her family departed the expedition. Lewis and Clark prepared for their journey back to St. Louis, but before they left, Clark offered to take Sacagawea's son Pomp back to St. Louis with him. He would see that Pomp received a good education and would raise Pomp as his own. Sacagawea and Charbonneau felt Pomp was too young, he was not even yet 2 years old, and indicated they would bring him to St. Louis when he was older. Little is known about Sacagawea's life after the expedition. When Pomp was 5, Sacagawea and Charbonneau brought him to St. Louis and left him with Clark to oversee his education. Sacagawea and Charbonneau then went back to the upper Missouri River area and worked for Manuel Liza, a Missouri Fur Company trader. Sacagawea likely gave birth to a daughter named Lizette in 1812. There is some ambiguity around Sacagawea's death. Records from Fort Manuel Lisa's trading post, indicate that she died of typhus on December 1812. However, according to some Native American oral histories, Sacagawea lived for many more years in the Shoshone lands in Wyoming until she died in 1884. Barbary War. The First Barbary War was an undeclared war waged by the United States against North African states of Morocco, Tripoli, Algiers, and Tunis. The principal cause of the war was that those states harbored and supported pirates' actions against American shipping vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. The war, which lasted from 1801 to 1805, did not ultimately end the acts of piracy against American ships, but it did prove that the United States could wage war, if necessary, in places far from its shores. The four Barbary states of North Africa, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, had plundered seaborne commerce for centuries. Surviving by blackmail, they received tremendous sums of money, ships, and arms yearly from foreign powers in return for allowing the foreigners to trade in African ports and sail unmolested through the Barbary waters. They demanded tribute money, seized ships, and held crews for ransom or sold them into slavery. During the Crusades, Muslim pirates operating from bases in North Africa had plundered ships carrying crusaders and pilgrims and sold many Christians into slavery. By the 16th century, Habsburg Spain and the Ottoman Turks were pitted in a struggle for supremacy in the Mediterranean. Piracy, which for both Christians and Muslims was a dimension of conflict between the opposing powers, lured adventurers from around the Mediterranean to the Maghribi coastal towns and inlands. Among them was Khayr ad-Din, called Barbarossa, who in 1510 seized Algiers on the pretext of defending it from the Spaniards. Barbarossa subsequently recognized the sovereignty of the Ottoman Sultan over the territory that he controlled and appointed the Sultan's regent in the Maghreb. The term Barbary derives from Barbarossa, or red beard. By the end of the 18th century, the effectiveness of Tripoli's corsairs had long since deteriorated. Still, their reputation alone was enough to prompt European maritime states to pay the tribute extorted by the Pasha to ensure safe passage of their shipping through the Tripolitan waters. American merchant ships, no longer covered by British protection, were seized by Barbary pirates after United States independence, and American crews were enslaved. In 1799, the United States agreed to pay $18,000 a year in return to promise that Tripoli-based corsairs would not molest American ships. Similar agreements were made at the time with the rulers of Morocco, Algiers, and Tunis. In May 1801, the United States refused to succumb to the increasing demands of the Pasha of Tripoli. In return, the Pasha declared war against the states. While Tripoli was not a strong power and little effort was necessary to watch and blockade it, the fear was that the other Barbary forces would join against the United States. The United States sent naval squadrons into the Mediterranean under the slogan of "Millions for defense, but not one cent for tribute." Under the leadership of Commodores Richard Dale and Edward Preble, the Navy blockaded the enemy coast, bombarded his shore fortresses, and engaged in close, bitterly contested gunboat action. On February 16, 1804, Lieutenant Stephen Decatur led 74 volunteers into Tripoli's harbor to burn the Philadelphia's captured American frigate. British Admiral Lord Nelson called the raid the most daring act of the age. Boatswain's mate Reuben James volunteered to go on the raiding party. James was seriously wounded during a hand-to-hand combat. Despite his wounds, or perhaps because of them, James put himself between an attacking pirate and the commander of that raid, Decatur, who remained uninjured thanks to James. Reuben James recovered from his wounds and continued to serve his navy for another 32 years proudly. Lieutenant Stephen Decatur's exploit in destroying the captured frigate USS Philadelphia and Captain Richard Sumner's attempt with the fireship USS Intrepid to blow up enemy vessels in Tripoli harbor set valorous examples for the young naval service. In 1805, Marines stormed the Barbary pirates' harbor fortress stronghold of Derma in Tripoli, commemorated in the Marine Corps hymn Invocation to the Shores of Tripoli. First Lieutenant O'Bannon is remembered for heroism in the Battle of Derma. O'Bannon's Marines were the first U.S. forces to hoist the flag over territory in the Old World. The Mameluke sword, carried by Marines officers today, was presented to O'Bannon in 1805. In June 1805, Tobias Lears negotiated a peace settlement with the Pasha. However, this treaty was made only by stepping on the toes of William Eaton. William Eaton had been appointed consul to Tunis in 1798. When Tripoli declared war in 1801, he and special diplomat James L. Cathcart tried to work out a settlement. They believed that to effect peace with that country, they needed to reinstate the exiled Hamet Karamanali to the throne. This ruler had been overthrown and exiled by his brother. Eaton returned to the States to present their plans to Congress. In 1804, he returned to the Mediterranean with the new title Navy Agent to the Barbary States and permission to carry out his plans. Just as Eaton was about to see his ideas come to fruition, he was suddenly ordered to leave Tripoli. Lear's treaty was accepted instead, and the phrase "to the shores of Tripoli" was added to the Marines' battle hymn. The Second Barbary War in 1815, also known as the Algerine or Algerian War, was the second of two wars fought between the United States and the Ottoman Empire's North African regencies of Tripoli, Tunis, Algeria, and known collectively as the Barbary States. The war was between the Barbary States and the U.S. ended in 1815. The international dispute would effectively be concluded by following year of the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. The war brought an end to the Americans' practice of paying tribute to the pirate states and helped mark the beginning of the end of piracy in that region, which had been rampant in the days of Ottoman domination. Within decades, European powers built ever more sophisticated and expensive ships, which the Barbary pirates could not match in numbers or technology. Following the War of 1812, two naval squadrons under Commodores Decatur and Bainbridge returned to the Mediterranean. Diplomacy backed by resolute force soon brought the rulers of Barbary to terms and gained widespread respect for the new American nation. Decatur obtained treaties that eliminated the United States from paying tribute. In the years immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815, the European powers forced an end to piracy and the payment of tribute in the Barbary states. After the First Barbary War, the European nations had been engaged in warfare with one another. However, in years immediately following the Second Barbary War, there were no general European war. This allowed the Europeans to build up their resources and challenge Barbary powers in the Mediterranean without distraction. Over the following century, Algiers and Tunis became colonies of France in 1830 and 1881, respectively, while Tripoli returned to the control of the Ottoman Empire in 1835. In 1911, taking advantage of the power vacuum left by the fading Ottoman Empire, Italy assumed control of Tripoli. Europeans remained in control of the government in eastern North Africa until the mid-20th century. By then, the ironclad warships of the late 19th century and the dreadnoughts of the early 20th century ensured European dominance of the Mediterranean. Atlantic slave trade. The legal transatlantic slave trade reached unprecedented levels in the late 18th century. Still, by the mid-19th century, every national carrier in Europe and the Americas had formally abolished the traffic. Denmark was the first nation to repeal its trade in 1803. Britain and the United States followed in 1807, with the U.S. ban going into effect in 1808. By 1836, the Dutch, French, Spanish, Brazilian, and Portuguese governments abolished their trades. During just 3 decades, every national transatlantic carrier outlawed a massive system of forced migration that lasted for 3 centuries. According to historians, the relatively rapid abolition of the transatlantic slave trade is explained by an ideological, religious, and economic change in Europe and the Americas. There's much debate about which factor was most important. Scholars of the ideological school identify abolitionism's origin in the Enlightenment. This influential 18th century intellectual movement suggested that all men, and to an extent women, held certain rights. Among these rights was liberty, which the slave trade quickly violated. Other scholars privilege the role and some evangelical religious groups, such as the Quakers. By the late 18th and early 19th century, the latter saw abolitionism as an expression of the Christian love for their fellow man. Other historians emphasize economic motives. One early theory was that Britain abolished its slave trade because British Caribbean plantations were becoming less profitable and needed fewer slaves. Today, most scholars contest this theory and argue that slavery and the slave trade was still thriving when the trades were banned in the 19th century. The case for U.S. abolitionism indicates that the blend of ideological, religious, and economic factors varied according to specific national contexts. In early America, black and white abolitionists channeled their spirit of both the Enlightenment and the American Revolution in their cries for liberty. In addition, American anti-slavery evangelicals spread their message widely in the United States. On the economic front, slavery and the slave trade had become increasingly marginal in the livelihoods of many Northerners, which weakened their resistance to the abolition of the slave trade. At the same time, in the Upper South, politically influential slaveholders supported repeal to strengthen the domestic slave trade to Lower South. These planters believed that if they had not abolished the transatlantic trade, it would compete with the domestic traffic in supplying slaves to the Lower South, where plantations were expected to flourish in the 19th century. The transatlantic slave trade was an international industry, which meant that the international cooperation was required to enforce abolition once national bans were in place. In the early 19th century, many governments representing former slaving powers signed multinational anti-slave trade treaties. These accords affirmed signatories' commitments to abolition, established common standards for banning slave trading equipment from commercial vessels and outlined joint responsibilities to maintain anti-slave trade patrols in Africa and Caribbean waters. Britain provided the largest and most effective anti-slave trade fleet, but France, Portugal, and the United States also manned lightly armed flotillas. In addition, most powers recognized a newly established network of international courts designed to adjudicate criminal slave trading cases, known as the Courts of Mixed Commission. By the mid-19th century, these courts were established in Brazil, the Caribbean, West Africa, and South Africa. Despite these efforts, abolition legislation and international cooperation did not end the transatlantic slave trade. Although abolition was primarily implemented in the British and French Empire, and only a few slave ships are known to have arrived on U.S. shores after 1808, slave importations to Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico increased after the trade was outlawed. Underdeveloped plantation economies in these jurisdictions created a massive demand for slave labor and record profits for illegal slave traders. Most Brazilian and Cuban policymakers linked economic growth with continued slave imports, and many tactically supported the unlawful traffic. Similarly, in Africa, organizations with long slave trading were unwilling to or unable to halt the supply of captives to the coast or expel foreign slave dealers residing there, despite commitments to do both. Meanwhile, the illegal slave trade became increasingly difficult to suppress. British and American merchants engaged indirectly in the traffic by supplying Latin American slave traders with ships and goods interchangeable for captives on the African coast. The U.S. government also denied other nations the right to search U.S. ships suspected of slave trading, and soon a large portion of the total illegal transatlantic slave traffic took place under the shield of the U.S. flag. Under these conditions, slave imports to Brazil and Cuba rose to levels higher than those before abolition. Suppression of the illegal transatlantic slave trade only became effective when external pressures on slave importing regions were bolstered by changing public opinions within those societies. In 1850, domestic reformers in Brazil forced a clampdown on the illegal slave trade with a British naval blockade of Rio de Janeiro. At that point, Cuba became the last large-scale slave importation zone. It was not until 1867, after widespread abolitionist pressure within the Spanish Empire and in light of emancipation in Cuba's much larger neighbor, the United States, after a violent civil war, that the Spanish government moved decisively against the illegal transatlantic slave trade, ending the traffic for good.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show is produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.